You think a few mosquitoes are annoying? Try surviving in the desert where every fly, every gnat, every biting insect sees you as the only meal for miles. No screens, no spray bottles, no citronella candles, just sand, heat, and swarms that never quit. Yet the Bedouins thrived where insects should have driven them mad. Using methods so simple, we forgot they existed. In the desert, insects aren't just irritating. They're dangerous. Flies cluster around water, food, animals, anywhere moisture exists. They land on wounds, spoil supplies, spread disease. One fly carries bacteria from camel dung to your drinking water. Another lands on a cut, depositing eggs that hatch into larvae within hours. In a place where the nearest settlement could be 3 days away by camel, where a single infection could turn fatal before you reached help, the Bedouins couldn't afford to ignore them. The desert breeds resilient insects. These aren't the lazy house flies of settled towns. Desert flies are aggressive, persistent, evolved over millennia to exploit every source of moisture in an environment that offers almost none. They sense the carbon dioxide in your breath from dozens of meters away. They detect body heat through the shimmering air. They find the water in your eyes, your mouth, any exposed mucous membrane. And they don't give up. Swat one away, and 3 more take its place. Water sources became battlegrounds. Every oasis, every well, every precious water skin attracted swarms. The Bedouins had to drink from the same pools where flies laid eggs. They had to water their animals knowing insects would follow the herd back to camp. They had to store supplies knowing that a single overlooked date could draw hundreds of flies, and those flies would spread to everything else. In the desert, you can't separate water from insects. Where one exists, the other follows within hours. The challenge was unique. Unlike settled peoples who could build permanent barriers or maintain gardens of repellent plants, nomads had to carry their solutions. Everything had to be lightweight, renewable, and effective with minimal resources. A farmer could plant acres of insect-repelling herbs around his home. A Bedouin carried what fit in his saddlebag. A villager could screen his windows and doors. A tent had openings on all sides for ventilation. Blocking insects meant blocking the only thing that made desert heat survivable: airflow. They couldn't rely on a single method. The desert demanded a system, multiple layers of defense, woven into every aspect of camp life. Because insects adapted, they found ways through one barrier. You needed 3 more waiting. They learned to navigate smoke. You had to vary the materials you burned. They timed their attacks to evening coolness. You had to anticipate and prepare before dusk arrived. And the stakes were constant. Spoiled food meant hunger. Infected wounds meant fever. Disease meant death. But perhaps worst of all was the psychological toll. Imagine trying to sleep with flies crawling across your face. Trying to eat with gnats swarming every bite. Trying to rest during the hottest hours while insects probed every inch of exposed skin. In the desert, where rest was crucial for survival, insects could exhaust you without ever drawing blood. Different seasons brought different threats. Spring rains created temporary pools where mosquitoes bred in massive numbers. Summer heat drove certain biting flies to seek shade, the same shade humans desperately needed. Autumn winds carried swarms from distant wetlands. Winter cold reduced insect activity, but the few that remained were desperate, aggressive, drawn to any source of warmth. The Bedouins had to adjust their defenses constantly, reading the season and the wind like a battle commander reading enemy movements. Children were especially vulnerable. Young skin attracted more bites. Small bodies had less tolerance for the diseases insects carried. Mothers learned to wrap infants completely, leaving only the smallest breathing space. They learned which plants, when crushed and rubbed on cloth, created barriers insects wouldn't cross. They learned to position cradles in the flow of smoke, in the path of wind, anywhere the air moved enough to discourage landing flies. The livestock complicated everything. Camels, goats, sheep, they were essential for survival, but they were insect magnets. Animals couldn't swat effectively, couldn't cover themselves, couldn't escape to closed spaces. Flies tormented them constantly, clustering around eyes, mouths, wounds. Stressed animals produced less milk, moved slower, weakened faster. Protecting the herd meant protecting your wealth, your food supply, your only means of transportation. Insect control wasn't just human comfort. It was economic survival. Some insects were deadlier than others. Certain flies carried parasites that burrowed under skin. Others spread diseases that decimated herds. Still others were simply so numerous, so persistent, that they made normal life impossible. The Bedouins learned to identify threats by sight, by sound, by the pattern of their movement. They knew which buzzing meant mosquitoes, which meant biting flies, which meant harmless nuisances. That knowledge determined which defenses to deploy, where to focus limited resources. But here's what the Bedouins understood that we've forgotten. You can't win against insects. Not in their environment. Not on their terms. The desert belongs to them more than it belongs to you. They reproduce faster, adapt quicker, outnumber you by millions to one. Fighting them directly is exhausting and futile. Instead, the Bedouins learned to become invisible, to create an environment where insects chose easier targets, to make their camps, their bodies, their animals less appealing than the vast, empty desert around them. This wasn't comfort. This wasn't convenience. This was the difference between a tribe that thrived and a tribe that died of disease and exhaustion before reaching the next water source. In the desert, everything connects. Insect control affected health, which affected energy, which affected ability to travel, which affected survival. One breach in the defense could cascade into disaster. The first weapon was fire. Not just any fire, but the right kind of smoke. In the desert, fire served many purposes. It cooked food, provided warmth on cold nights, signaled to distant travelers. But for the Bedouins, fire's most valuable purpose might have been the one that produced no heat, no light. Just thick, aromatic smoke that turned the air itself into a barrier. Bedouins learned early that certain materials, when burned, created smoke that insects despised. Not all smoke worked equally. Burning dry brush produced heat and light, but offered little protection. Plain wood smoke irritated human eyes as much as it bothered flies. But specific plants, specific materials, those created something different. A smoke that humans could tolerate but insects absolutely could not. Dried aromatic plants gathered during travels became essential cargo. Every time the tribe moved through an area where certain herbs grew, they collected and dried them. Not for medicine, though many had medicinal properties. Not for food, though some were edible. Specifically for burning. These plants contained essential oils, volatile compounds that, when heated, released into the air and overwhelmed insect senses. The Bedouins didn't know the chemistry. They just knew it worked. The process was deliberate. You didn't throw these plants directly into flames. That burned them too quickly, wasted their potency. Instead, you placed them on hot coals or at the edge of a fire where they smoldered slowly. The goal wasn't combustion. It was controlled release, a steady stream of scented smoke that could last for hours from just a handful of dried leaves. Different plants produced different effects. Some created thick, heavy smoke that hung close to the ground, perfect for protecting sitting or sleeping areas. Others produced lighter, more aromatic smoke that dispersed widely, creating a protective zone around the entire camp. The Bedouins learned which plants to use for which situations, which combinations worked best together, which could be burned sparingly, and which needed generous quantities to be effective. The smoke from animal dung, particularly camel dung, served double duty. As fuel, it was precious. Wood was scarce in the desert, so dried dung became the primary burning material for cooking and warmth. But the Bedouins discovered something crucial. The smoke it produced wasn't just a byproduct. It was a weapon. Dung smoke was thick, pungent, and deeply unpleasant to flies. It hung in the air longer than would smoke, creating a persistent barrier. When burned slowly, dung released compounds that confused insect navigation. Flies and gnats rely heavily on scent to locate hosts. They track carbon dioxide from breathing, lactic acid from sweat, dozens of other chemical signatures that scream, food source here. Dung smoke masked all of it. To an insect, a camp shrouded in that smoke became invisible, or at least indistinguishable from the background noise of the desert. The strategic placement of fires mattered as much as what burned in them. Small fires were positioned upwind of tents, so the smoke would drift through the camp. Others were placed near animal enclosures, protecting livestock. Some were set at the camp perimeter, creating a smoke wall that insects had to penetrate to reach human areas. The Bedouins understood wind patterns, how air moved differently at dawn versus dusk, where to position smoke for maximum effect with minimum fuel. Timing was everything. Early morning and dusk, when flies were most active, when temperatures moderated and insects emerged from hiding. That's when fires were tended most carefully. Fresh aromatic materials were added to coals. Dung was positioned to smolder steadily. Smoke was encouraged to flow through living spaces. During midday heat, when both humans and insects sought refuge, the fires were often allowed to die down. No need to waste resources when the enemy was dormant. Some plants were especially prized. In areas where they grew, the Bedouins collected herbs from the mint family, plants with oils so strong that crushing a single leaf released enough scent to clear a small space. Others sought plants with camphor-like properties, or those that produced particularly thick, clinging smoke. These weren't everyday fuel. They were tactical reserves, saved for times when insect pressure was highest or when sickness made someone especially vulnerable. The knowledge of which plants worked best was passed down through generations. Young people learned to identify useful species during travels, to recognize them by leaf shape and scent, to know the right time of year for collection and the proper methods for drying and storage. This wasn't casual knowledge. It was survival curriculum, as important as knowing how to find water or read the stars. Modern science later confirmed what the Bedouins knew through centuries of observation. Many aromatic plants contain compounds like linalool, camphor, eucalyptol, and various terpenes, molecules that interfere with insect sensory receptors. When these compounds are released into the air through burning or crushing, they overwhelm the insect's ability to detect hosts. What smells pleasant or at least tolerable to humans, like burning sage, dried mint, or aromatic resins, registers as a noxious alarm to flies and mosquitoes. But the Bedouins also understood something else. Smoke alone wasn't enough. Insects adapted. A fly driven away by smoke would circle, wait, return when the smoke thinned. Persistent swarms could push through even thick smoke barriers if they were desperate enough. So smoke became the first layer, not the only layer. It reduced insect numbers, created zones of relative safety, bought time for other defenses to work. The ritual of fire tending became woven into daily routines. Someone always monitored the smoke fires, adding material when needed, adjusting position as wind shifted, ensuring the protective barrier never fully collapsed. During evening meals, when people gathered and food attracted flies, extra attention was paid to smoke production. During sleep, smoldering fires were positioned near tent openings, creating a barrier that insects had to cross to reach sleeping people. And there was an unexpected benefit. The smoke didn't just repel insects. It also reduced moisture in the air immediately around the camp. Drier air meant fewer mosquitoes, since they required humidity for flight. It meant less condensation on water skins and food stores, reducing the moisture that attracted flies. The smoke created a microclimate, slightly drier, slightly more aromatic, significantly less hospitable to the pests that made desert life unbearable. But smoke alone wasn't enough. The real defense began before you ever lit a fire. It began with where you chose to stop. In the desert, location determined everything. Choose wrong, and no amount of smoke or covering would save you from insect torment. Choose right, and half the battle was won before you unpacked your first bag. Bedouins never camped near stagnant water. It sounds counterintuitive. Water was life. Every drop was precious. Yet they understood a truth that modern science would later confirm. Standing water breeds insects by the thousands. One small pool, sitting undisturbed for a few days, could hatch enough mosquitoes to make a square kilometer uninhabitable. The temporary convenience of close water access meant permanent warfare with swarms. Instead, they chose elevated positions. A slight rise in the land, a gentle slope, anywhere the wind could flow freely. Air movement was worth more than shade, more than soft sand, more than proximity to resources. Because wind is the enemy of flying insects. A steady breeze disrupts their flight patterns, makes landing difficult, forces them to expend more energy to reach targets. Most insects, faced with strong wind, simply give up and seek calmer hunting grounds. The science is simple but profound. Flies and mosquitoes are weak flyers. They maneuver well in still air, but struggle against even modest breezes. A wind speed of just 4 or 5 kilometers per hour, barely enough to stir sand. cuts mosquito landing attempts by more than half. At 10 kilometers per hour, most flying insects become effectively grounded. The Bedouins didn't know the numbers, but they knew the result. Camps on breezy rises had fewer pests. They watched dust and sand movement before choosing a site. Where did the prevailing wind come from? What time of day did it strengthen or die down? Were there natural barriers that blocked airflow? A camp tucked behind a dune might offer protection from sandstorms, but it also created still air, perfect for insects. Better to face some wind and sand than to face clouds of biting flies and dead calm. Distance from livestock was calculated with precision. Animals attracted flies in overwhelming numbers. Camels, goats, sheep, their dung, their breath, their body heat drew insects like nothing else. You needed animals close enough to guard, to milk, to hear if predators approached, but not so close that their insect clouds merged with your living space. The solution was geometry and wind direction. Tents faced away from prevailing winds that blew across animal areas. If wind came from the north, animals stayed to the north, tents faced south. This meant insects drawn to livestock had to fly upwind to reach humans, a journey most weren't willing or able to make. When the wind shifted, sometimes the entire camp layout adjusted. A few hours of moving tents and repositioning animals was worth days of reduced insect pressure. Livestock were kept slightly downhill when terrain allowed. Insects tend to fly slightly downward, following the easiest path. By keeping animals lower in elevation, you created another barrier. Flies drawn to the herd had to fly upward, against both wind and their natural flight tendency, to reach human areas. Most took the easy path, staying with the concentrated scent and heat of the animals. But proximity wasn't the only consideration. Animal areas were managed for insect control too. Dung was cleared regularly, not just for cleanliness, but because fresh dung attracted fewer flies than dung left to sit and ferment. Animals were moved frequently, never allowed to create the kind of concentrated waste areas that became breeding grounds. In the nomadic lifestyle, this came naturally. You moved camp every few days anyway. But it also meant insects never had time to establish populations. Cleanliness in the camp wasn't just about tidiness. It was survival protocol. Food waste was buried immediately, far from tents and sleeping areas. Not scattered on the surface where it would attract flies. Buried deep enough that insects couldn't detect it, that scavengers couldn't dig it up. In the desert, there's no trash collection. No one comes to haul away your garbage. Everything you discard either travels with you or gets neutralized on site. Water containers were covered tightly, not just to prevent evaporation, though that mattered, but to eliminate standing water surfaces where insects could drink and breed. Bowls and cups were emptied completely after use, never left with residual water sitting in the bottom. Washing areas were positioned downwind and away from living spaces, and water used for washing was poured on a sand that would absorb it quickly, not on a hard ground where it might pool. Anything that could attract flies was removed or sealed within minutes. Milk after milking, covered immediately. Blood from butchering, buried with the offal. Sweat-soaked clothing, hung in direct sun where heat and UV light killed bacteria that produced attractive odors. The Bedouins understood that flies weren't drawn to objects. They were drawn to the volatile compounds those objects released. Eliminate the smell, and you eliminated the attraction. The tent fabric itself played a defensive role. That thick goat hair weaving wasn't chosen just for temperature control. The texture and smell of the wool, particularly when unwashed, still holding natural oils, acted as a mild deterrent. Insects found it less appealing than the smooth surfaces of modern materials. And the dark color absorbed heat on the outside, creating temperature differentials that affected airflow around the tent structure. The tent's design incorporated insect defense into its architecture. Walls that could be raised for airflow meant insects had to navigate moving air currents to enter. The height of the tent, usually around 2 meters, created zones. Warmest air rose to the top, carrying insects upward. Cooler air settled at ground level where people sat and slept. Proper ventilation meant constant air exchange, preventing the still pockets where insects preferred to hover. Entrance positioning mattered enormously. The main opening faced the prevailing breeze when possible, creating positive air pressure inside the tent. Air flowing out through other gaps and seams created a barrier that insects struggled to penetrate. It's the same principle modern buildings use with positive pressure ventilation, except the Bedouins achieved it with nothing but fabric positioning and wind awareness. Interior organization followed insect logic. Sleeping areas were positioned in the zones with best airflow. Food storage placed in the coolest, driest spots where it released the least attractive odors. Water kept covered and elevated, making it harder for insects to access. Everything had its place, and that place was chosen not just for convenience, but for defensive value. Carpets and rugs served multiple purposes. They insulated from ground heat, provided comfort, but they also created barriers. Many insects, especially fleas and certain beetles, traveled along the ground. Thick woven rugs blocked their access, created a layer they couldn't easily penetrate. The regular shaking and beating of these textiles removed any insects that did find their way into the fibers. The space between tents mattered too. Too close, and you lost airflow. Too far, and you lost the communal defense that smoke fires provided. The ideal spacing, worked out through generations of experience, created overlapping zones of protection. Smoke from one fire drifted to neighboring areas. Wind channeled through gaps kept air moving. The camp became an integrated defensive unit, not just a collection of individual shelters. And finally, the Bedouins practiced what modern military strategists call defense in depth. No single barrier was perfect, so they created multiple layers. First, camp location reduced insect numbers through wind and elevation. Second, distance from livestock reduced concentrated swarms. Third, cleanliness eliminated attractants. Fourth, tent design created airflow barriers. Each layer caught insects the previous layer missed, until very few made it through to the humans inside. On the body, the Bedouins relied on their clothing. Those same loose, covering garments that protected from sun and retained moisture also blocked insects. It wasn't coincidence. The design had evolved over centuries to solve multiple problems simultaneously, and insect defense was crucial among them. Flies can't bite through fabric. That simple fact drove entire wardrobe decisions. The layers were strategic. A loose outer robe, the abaya, hung far enough from the skin that even if an insect landed on the fabric, it couldn't reach flesh to bite. Beneath that, another layer of lighter cloth. The air gap between layers created a buffer zone. An insect that somehow penetrated the outer fabric still faced another barrier, and by then, the movement of the wearer usually dislodged it before it found skin. Every inch of skin stayed covered, not because of modesty alone, though that was part of the culture, but because exposed skin in the desert was a target for every biting insect within range. Arms, legs, neck, all wrapped in fabric. The head covering was particularly crucial. Wrapped carefully around face and neck, it left only the eyes exposed. Some Bedouins even used fine mesh across the face during heavy insect seasons, reducing visibility slightly, but preventing flies from accessing mouth and nose. The fabric choice mattered. Tightly woven cloth blocked insects better than loose weaves. But tight weaves also trapped heat, creating the suffocating discomfort that could be as dangerous as sun exposure. The solution was layers of moderate weave, not so tight that air couldn't pass, not so loose that insects could penetrate. Multiple moderate layers outperformed a single tight layer in both comfort and protection. Color played a subtle role. Darker fabrics absorbed heat on the outside, but created temperature gradients that affected airflow. Insects are drawn to dark colors because they associate them with shadows and protected areas. But when that dark fabric is hot from sun exposure, the heat rising from it creates a thermal barrier. Insects approaching that barrier encounter sudden temperature shifts that disrupt their flight, often causing them to veer away before landing. Certain plant oils, when available, were rubbed on exposed skin. Not constantly. Resources were too precious for daily application. But before sleep, when you were most vulnerable and least able to swat away insects, a light application provided hours of protection. Or when traveling through areas known for heavy insect populations, a treatment before departure could make the journey tolerable. The plants used varied by region and season. Whatever aromatic herbs grew in the areas the tribe traveled, those became the source material. Leaves were crushed by hand, releasing essential oils, then rubbed on wrists, ankles, behind ears. The pulse points where blood flow brought warmth close to the surface, where insects most often targeted. The scent didn't last long in the dry air, but it lasted long enough. Some used animal fats mixed with aromatic plant material, creating a more persistent barrier. The fat sealed moisture against the skin, valuable in the desiccating desert air, while also holding plant oils in place longer. This wasn't perfume. The smell was often sharp, medicinal, unpleasant to human noses. But it was far more unpleasant to insects, and that was all that mattered. Application was minimal. A small amount on key areas provided protection without waste. The Bedouins understood that complete coverage wasn't necessary. Insects have preferred landing zones on the human body. Protect those zones, and you reduce bites by most of the potential. Leave the forearms bare but protect the wrists and hands, and you've eliminated the majority of landing attempts. Movement patterns mattered as much as barriers. Bedouins moved deliberately, avoiding the quick gestures that attracted insect attention. Sudden movements create air currents that insects sense from surprising distances. A swatting hand generates a specific pattern of air displacement that actually draws attention rather than repelling it. Better to move slowly, predictably, maintaining the wind currents your smoke and positioning had already established. Swatting at flies was considered futile and counterproductive. A fly swatted away returns within seconds, often more agitated and persistent. Multiple flies in an area will actually increase their activity when one is swatted, as if alerted to a food source worth defending. The Bedouin response was different. Ignore the fly. Let smoke do its work. Trust your defenses. Most insects, finding no easy landing zone and no reaction to exploit, would eventually move on to test easier targets. Stillness was a practice skill. During the hottest hours, when both humans and insects sought shade, the ability to remain motionless reduced your profile. Insects detect motion, heat, and carbon dioxide. Stillness reduced the first. Shade reduced the second. And shallow breathing, another practice technique, reduced the third. A person sitting perfectly still in smoke-filtered shade became nearly invisible to insect senses. This stillness wasn't meditation or relaxation technique. It was tactical. Children were taught early to sit without fidgeting during insect-heavy times of day. Adults modeled the behavior, showing how to rest without the constant motion that would draw every fly in the area. In the desert, where rest was crucial for conserving energy and water, the ability to rest undisturbed by insects was itself a survival skill. And when insects did bite, the response was immediate and systematic. The Bedouins had remedies, but more importantly, they had protocols. First, remove the insect without crushing it against the skin. Crushing released more irritating compounds into the bite. Second, clean the area immediately with whatever water could be spared. Third, apply plant poultices that reduced swelling and prevented infection. Certain herbs were known for their anti-inflammatory properties. Crushed and applied to fresh bites, they reduced the body's reaction, minimizing swelling and itching. This wasn't just comfort, it was resource conservation. Every bite that swelled drew moisture to the area, moisture your body had to spare from other processes. Itching caused scratching, scratching opened wounds, wounds risked infection. Better to treat aggressively at the first sign than to deal with complications later. Prevention was always preferable to cure. Every bite was moisture lost to swelling, energy wasted on healing. In a place where your body's resources determined survival, avoiding insect damage wasn't about comfort, it was about conservation. A person covered in bites lost water through swelling, lost sleep to itching, lost efficiency to constant distraction. Over days and weeks, that accumulated damage could mean the difference between reaching the next water source with strength remaining or arriving exhausted and dehydrated. The Bedouins also understood the psychological dimension. Insect harassment wears down mental resilience. The constant buzzing, the persistent landing attempts, the itching from previous bites, it grinds away at your patience and focus. In an environment already demanding maximum alertness for navigation, weather reading, and threat detection, you couldn't afford the mental drain of constant insect warfare. So they built routines that reduced that drain. Morning checks of sleeping areas for insects that had entered during the night. Evening preparation of smoke fires before insects became active. Midday retreat to the most protected areas during peak insect hours. These routines created psychological comfort as much as physical protection. You knew what to expect, knew what to do, knew that your defenses would work if you maintained them properly. Children learned by observation and participation. A young Bedouin watched how adults positioned themselves relative to smoke, noticed which clothing was chosen for travel versus camp, saw the careful application of plant oils before sleep, participated in the cleaning and organizing that eliminated insect attractants. This knowledge became instinctive, woven into the fabric of daily life until defensive behaviors happened automatically, without conscious thought. The Bedouins never eliminated insects. That was impossible in an environment where insects had evolved for millions of years and humans were recent arrivals. But they made themselves less appealing than everything else around them. Through covering, through positioning, through scent and smoke, through movement and stillness, they became difficult targets. Not invisible, but difficult enough that insects, faced with easier options or simply exhausted by the effort, chose to hunt elsewhere. In the desert, survival belonged to those who understood that the best defense is the one your enemy never notices. Not fighting the insects directly. Not declaring war on an enemy that outnumbers you by billions. Just making sure they flew past, searching for easier prey that didn't exist, while you remained covered, protected, shrouded in smoke and scent that told them, this target isn't worth the effort. Move on.